Greetings.
And welcome back to another video talking about The Flash. Nope, it's Star Trek. It's Star Trek. So it's now been 2 years since I first ranted about the Picard series, and in that time, I've gone back to watch all the old Star Trek series. I've watched Firefly, Babylon 5, a few other shows, and a whole bunch of movies. And you know, I really feel like I've gotten out there and seen what life has to offer, and maybe I can finally forget that Star Trek Picard ever existed. So I have seen the trailers for Season 2, and while I'm not holding out any hope for it to actually be good, of course, or deliver on the original promise of it being a meditative psychological character study about Jean-Luc Picard, I did have an idea for a direction it could take that might make it interesting to watch. So, we know that this season is going to involve Q, time travel into an alternate timeline, manipulation of said timeline by Q, again, another Borg tease to make the trailer look interesting, the next US presidential election year, a fascist government that looks kind of like the Mirror Universe, and presumably a quest to fix the new past so that it becomes the familiar future, or I guess present. Now in Trek we've seen this same fix the timeline plot many times, but this time I think it could have a twist. Here's my theory. Picard and crew will have to cause World War III. Hear me out. In the original series episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, the Enterprise visits an old planet with a time portal on it, but on the way down, when it hits a bump in the road, McCoy inadvertently ejects himself with all the drugs. And then in a frenzy, he runs through the portal back to 1930 and manages to cause such a drastic change to the timeline that Hitler wins World War II and Starfleet, along with the Federation, never exist. So, Kirk and Spock go after Bones to stop him from causing the change, and then, spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen the episode, go here to skip past it. They realize that the only way to fix the timeline was to let a woman, who Kirk obviously falls in love with, die right in front of his eyes. It's a bittersweet ending where the pragmatic solution is morally questionable and comes at a great personal cost to the heroes, or Kirk at least. So keeping that same concept of pragmatism in mind, there is another pivotal event in the Star Trek universe which, in my opinion, also needed to happen before there could be a Starfleet or Federation as we know it: World War III. In short, the Third World War was a nuclear exchange which destroyed most of the planet's major cities, collapsed governments, killed around 600 million people, and spanned nearly 30 years before leading into the era of the post-atomic horror. Humanity, as a collective, hit its rock bottom. Everything would change following the day first contact was made with the Vulcans, causing the people of Earth to realize that they weren't in fact alone in the universe, and it inspired a new spirit of cooperation and unity with the desire to never again repeat the horrific events of the 21st century. Now here's where I'm going with all this. We know from the trailer that Season 2 takes place 2 years before the start of the original timeline's Third World War. We know that Picard and crew will have to find the way to undo the changes. We know that Q's trial of humanity has in the past employed the use of some dark irony, and we've established that from the very beginning, Star Trek wasn't afraid to have a dark, ironic kind of ending to a time travel plot. So what better test for humanity could there be that Q would think of than to force Picard, who himself has a moral ego the size of a galaxy class,
sheer fucking hubris,
to willingly cause the worst conflict in Earth's pre-warp history so that the future of the Federation would remain intact. I know, it sounds completely crazy, and they'd probably never do something like that now, but I just thought it would be a neat idea to throw out there. Now when Season 2 comes out, I'm not going to do another rant video about it. Instead, here's what I'll do. If it sucks and I don't like it, or what's more likely, if I don't make it all the way through to the end, I'm not going to post anything about it. I'm not going to even talk about it on the podcast. At this point, I don't think I need to explain how it's going to make continuity errors, have differences in the overall tone, or lack of aesthetic consistency. You pretty much know the way it goes for the newer live-action Trek shows, and I'll have more to say on that in a minute, but I just don't want to give it any more attention or effort than I think it deserves. But if it turns out to be decent and I actually enjoy it, then I'll talk about it after I've watched all the episodes. So with all that being said, I did want to also go back and address some of the things I talked about in the first 2 rant videos. After rewatching TNG and finishing the rest of the series from that era, I realized I may have been a bit off the mark with some of the claims I made, and now I want to set the record straight. Not because Kurtzman is holding a disruptor to my head, but because I think it's healthy to question everything, especially ourselves. Now, the main contention I was making in both videos was that Star Trek's main theme was always optimism, and that the future events set in the same timeline ought to reflect a positive direction for the characters and the setting. Now, while it is true that in general the main casts of each series portray a more evolved society with a higher sense of morality and an advanced level of competence in nearly every field, it's also true that the broader setting of Trek isn't as inherently idealistic. We see on multiple occasions how Starfleet is willing to prioritize pragmatism over its proclaimed virtues, how certain admirals and even former captains grow detached, self-absorbed, and straight up abandon Federation values in favor of their own agendas. The Federation itself is often seen as a utopia where no one is left wanting for resources, but that good fortune only extends so far into the Alpha Quadrant. The farther out planets and colonies on the edge of Federation space are shown to still be dealing with scarcity and conflict, often becoming the central focus of many episodes. And while there were hints that certain alliances may strengthen in the future, it was never a hard guarantee. With the Borg and the Dominion War leading to the remilitarization of Starfleet in what had become a complacent Federation, it wouldn't really be inconsistent for the darker, more pragmatic, and even corrupt elements of Starfleet to have gained a stronger foothold by the start of the 25th century. From an in-universe perspective, it could be said that the optimistic environment of life aboard the Enterprise, and by extension Earth, were the exceptions and not the rule, which is an important detail to remember for my next point. So the next thing I mentioned in the first video was that I didn't like the way the androids who looked like Data were being used as a workforce at the Mars shipyard, and how they were being othered by the human workers. I suggested it was a contradiction to the TNG episode Measure of a Man, where Data was legally given the right to choose to not undergo a procedure that may have erased his memory, effectively destroying the person he had become. The arguments in his favor were based on the vagueness of how he ascribed sentience and the implications of slavery that creating a race of worker Datas would create. While the trial resulted in a decision we as the viewers hoped would stick as precedent for future treatment of androids like Data, there was no guarantee that that would be the case. On multiple occasions, we've seen people not treat Data, or even the Doctor from Voyager, with the same respect as they would other organic beings. Starfleet has, on multiple occasions, shown its desire and willingness to utilize AIs to do work that's hazardous or otherwise undesirable to humans. The general attitude towards synthetic life in the Federation was not exactly generous. The crew of the Enterprise fully accepts Data as his own person, and even a friend, and the crew of Voyager eventually warmed up to the idea of the Doctor evolving past his initial programming and becoming his own person, but again, those are the exceptions and not the rule. With that said, it does seem like a stretch for the Federation to ban synthetic life entirely after all the interest they had in developing it as a tool, but for the story of Picard, I guess we're supposed to chalk that up to the influence of the Jadvash. Ugh, God, that still sounds stupid. Now let's talk about the Commodore, the F-bomb lady. I didn't care for how she spoke to Picard, but that shouldn't really have been a shock because it certainly wasn't the first time that a Starfleet higher up has been abrasive. It is obviously rather out of place to hear the F-word casually dropped in Star Trek, and I still think that they only did that for cheap shock value, but to play devil's advocate, let's look at why she chewed out Picard. As I mentioned, Picard and the Enterprise crew were essentially moral idealists, while Starfleet Command tended more towards a detached and pragmatic stance on most issues. Picard leaves Starfleet over its decision to not lend aid to the Romulans after the supernova destroyed their homeworld, and during the interview in the beginning of the first episode, he voices his dissent on a public forum, making it open knowledge for the first time that one of Starfleet's most well-known and respected figureheads did not support a major decision. This likely caused a PR nightmare for Starfleet, and to add to that, Picard shows up the very next day asking them for a favor. That's like if you quit working at a company, and then later on, you called out the CEO and said, yeah, whatever he's doing sucks, and then you went back the next day and asked for a favor from that same boss. It starts to make more sense why she responded the way she did. What I'm saying is, I don't like it, but I get it. Next, I questioned the narrative choice for Starfleet to not help the Romulan evacuation effort, despite the hope that we'd see friendlier relations in the future, given the warm exchange between Picard and the commander at the end of Nemesis, the Dominion War Alliance, and Spock's efforts towards peace and unification. Now, there's one major factor I could see as the cause of Starfleet's inaction, and it goes back to pragmatism, their tactical advantage. Romulans have been an enemy of the Federation for centuries, and towards the end of the Dominion War, Section 31 Sloan believed the next major conflict would again be with the Romulans, so it would make sense for the Federation to take advantage of what was effectively a free crippling blow to the Romulan Empire, or at least remain neutral and not aid them. If the writers were so inclined, we could also still see the Klingon Empire's hostile merger with the Romulans, like what was alluded to in All Good Things. Then we have the new ships, which I criticized and said they should have gotten Ralph McQuarrie or Doug Drexler to create the new designs, but I should have done my research before saying that because Ralph McQuarrie is no longer alive since 2012, and I also should have mentioned Andrew Probert, Rick Sternbach, and John Eves because they, along with Doug Drexler, did the majority, if not all of the ship design work for the Next Generation era, and in fact they did actually get John Eves to do some design work for Discovery and Picard, but as for the rest of them, they're probably all retired at this point. That aside, one justification for all the copy-paste ships that we see at the end could be that since the Borg and the Dominion threats, Starfleet has been mass-producing one configuration of warship to maintain battle readiness, but out of universe it still just looks lazy and cheap. Moving on to the second video, I pointed out the graphic violence. And yeah, Trek has had some graphic violence before, but for some reason, I think it just didn't seem as gratuitous in the past as it does here. Maybe it's also due to the fact that they casually drop F-bombs, and put that together with the violence, it kind of seems like they're just trying to be edgy to capture like a Game of Thrones audience since this is on streaming now. But at the same time, it still just doesn't seem to quite fit. Like sure, Kirk and Picard have said hell and damn plenty of times, and I actually agree with Michael Chabon's comment that a society which bans profanity would be a dystopia, but that's not what Star Trek has presented. In the original series, Uhura says that people no longer fear words, which if we're to take it literally means that people are no longer offended by any single word. And if you're not taking an offense to a particular word that's meant only to be used in an offensive way, then at that point the word loses all its power and essentially becomes meaningless. And considering that, it would make sense why Spock would react the way he does in Star Trek IV to the colorful metaphors. Then I questioned why Riker and Troy's daughter was blonde. It's because Troy had a secret, long-lost sister named Kestra for who she was named after, and she was also blonde. Lastly, I suggested that New Trek should return to a classic format since, it seemed to work well the first time around, for the most part. I haven't seen either of the newer animated series, so I can't comment on those, but Strange New Worlds is on its way, and that promises to be a return to the old format. Keyword being promises. So we'll see how that goes. Could be decent, but don't expect a miracle. So that's about all I had to say about all the things I had to say. And if you've stuck around this long, first of all, thanks for watching and listening. And if you want to hear more commentary like this, check out the podcast. It's on utterlynonsense.com and all the audio platforms you can imagine. You'll find it if you type it in. And there's more to come, so subscribe to the channel, follow on social media, whatever, and until next time.